Hello folks, I'm back with another video. This time I'm going to analyze something that happened very recently. Everybody's talking about it and it was quite shocking, to be honest. That was the Oscar slap. That's how the media is calling it right now. And I'm sure you've heard of it. I mean, if you are connected to the internet, if you have a TV, radio, or any type of media that you can access, you definitely heard of it. And it was the moment that after Chris Rock told a joke about Jada, Will Smith's wife, Will Smith felt very emotional, angry, and he actually stood up, walked to the stage, and slapped Chris Rock right there in his face. Again, something that had never happened before in the 94 years that the Oscar ceremony has been celebrated. And why am I exploring this fact, really? And I think it's a teachable moment. We're going to talk about the relationship between what happened to those three people and self-regulation, and what that has to do with executive functions. If you don't remember who I am, I'm André Hedlund. I have started this channel, EDC Rocks, on YouTube. Make sure you follow, you subscribe, you leave your comments, because here we are going to discuss education, psychology, neuroscience, and many interesting things, hopefully. And I think this is a case that, despite being quite negative, and I think actually very traumatic for everybody involved, and even those who watched the scene at the Oscars, I think we can learn something from it. And it relates directly to something that teachers, educators like us, we have to pay attention to when, of course, we're teaching our kids, especially kids, because childhood is a very important period of our lives. When something happens, something bad, something traumatizing, we can actually carry that for the rest of our lives. So let's get started. All right, so I'm a huge fan of the film industry. I gotta admit that. I've been very, let's say, lonely for most of my life and introverted in many ways, even though you might not know that. I've always been kind of quiet and, avoiding situations, like exposing myself. Even in class, when teachers asked me questions, I wanted to be left alone, right? So I think I lived most of my childhood away from people in a way, right? Because, when I went to school, I had my friends, but, I didn't want to interact as much. And then I would go home and it was just me, my parents, and no other kids to play with. And this is important because even though I think my childhood was great, it was really rich with, many wonderful experiences. And that's probably why today I am the person that I am, When you look at Will Smith, Jada Pinkett Smith, and Chris Rock, they have grown up in very heavy, negative environments filled with violence. That is true. I actually did a lot of research here, and I can tell you that all of them suffered some type of abuse growing up. And that messes with you because, it's not just genetics, but it's also your upbringing. And there are different forms of violence. So let's start by saying this. First of all, your brain is not as sophisticated as you might think. I know I've mentioned that a couple of times. I've actually said it is very sophisticated. But there are certain parts of the brain that developed first when we look at the evolutionary scale, that they're quite primitive and quite animal-like. As a matter of fact, we are all animals. We have primate brains, so we are related to chimpanzees, for example, and bonobos. At some point, we diverged, so we took different paths, so we have a common ancestor millions of years ago. And then we developed our brains in different ways. But one of the things that we know for sure is that we have it within us the potential to hurt other people, to be incredibly violent. This is really part of our evolutionary history. But as we evolved and we developed language and something even more important, which is our prefrontal cortex. So this area of our brains, the frontal lobe, is much more evolved than in other primates. And this area has a lot to do with self-regulation. But instead of using or resorting to physical violence, now, for the first time, we could actually have a conversation about our differences, and we could better control our impulses. We could self-regulate. So when you see something like what happened at the Oscars night, something in the brain of Will Smith and of course of Chris Rock didn't work quite effectively, and that is self-regulation. And why do I mention both of them? I'm not saying who was right or wrong. I think they were both wrong, very wrong actually. And maybe the violence, for me, the violence committed by Chris Rock was in many regards much more intense than the violence committed by Will Smith, which was physical, but he committed verbal violence. And I can show you what happens in the brain when we have that kind of violence. It's painful, just like physical pain, honestly. But anyway, Chris Rock could have avoided saying that Jada was going to star in the next G.I. Jane because of her bald head, right? He may have not known that she had a medical condition that caused her hair loss, but he decided to make fun of somebody's appearance. And that's always very painful. It's actually very violent from a brain perspective. And Will Smith could have self-regulated and could have dealt with that without physical violence. But the urge to hit Chris Rock was so unstoppable that he actually had to stand up and go do something about it. And that has to do with self-regulation. Again, we have primate brains, and our cousins, chimpanzees and bonobos, they are incredibly violent. Bonobos are less violent, they're more social. But they settle their disputes by attacking one another, sometimes even killing members of their tribe because of hierarchy, for example. Because they cannot control their impulses like we can. Sometimes we can't when we're going through a heightened emotional state like what happened during that night. It's very hard for you to find the cognitive resources to actually control your emotional state because you lack the ability to self-regulate. And for those of you who are wondering why I'm talking about this right now, this is actually part of the Learning Cosmos conceptual framework. So if you remember correctly, if you don't, go back to my previous video on the Learning Cosmos. But if you do remember correctly, there are certain spheres that influence how we can learn. The very first sphere is the self, and that has to do with self-awareness or your perception of self-worth, identity, and all of that. And then you have the cognitive sphere that has a lot to do with attention and memory. And finally, you have the emotional sphere. And I basically added emotion regulation that has to do with self-regulation as well, right? And emotional intelligence is choosing how to respond given a situation like that. And those things are incredibly important because they interfere with how we learn. So what is self-regulation really? A very good author, a big reference who discusses self-regulation is Stuart Shanker. So Stuart Shanker, self-reg, you can go to his website and you will see that he addresses some of the main problems with self-regulation, or the solutions actually. When you feel the urge to do something, to actually follow, let's say, an impulse, there are a couple of things you can do. You can reframe your behavior, right? You can rethink, reassess, reduce the stressors causing the behavior, and respond more adequately. so that you don't have to lose your temper, let's say. Now, for Will Smith to act like he did, and in front of billions of people who were actually watching the 94th Academy Awards ceremony, can you imagine how intense his emotional state was? Because he completely disregarded all of that, right? Which means that he was unable to reframe what was happening, to reduce the stressors, and to respond in a different way. He could have responded verbally, for example, or he could have sued Chris Rock, but he decided to act and be violent, physically violent. Chris Rock was also very violent. Like I said, even more violent, because he was making fun of somebody's health, somebody's medical condition, because of the way they look. And this is something that happens all over. As a matter of fact, I think this is probably what stand-up comedy is known for nowadays, right? I mean, it was always like that, people making fun of other people. This is incredibly hurtful and painful, and he could have self-regulated if he wanted to and avoid that, right? But he didn't. Now, why do I say that? There's an area in the brain that was identified by neuroscience, and it's called the cingulate cortex, right? The frontal area of this cortex is called the anterior cingulate cortex, and this area has to do with pain from social rejection, humiliation, neglect, and verbal violence. So whenever you grow up in a household where people don't care about how you feel, they abuse you verbally, psychologically, you feel pain. This area is activated, and it's pretty much like physical pain. Yes. As a matter of fact, going back to the idea of evolution, we can think of our brains getting bigger and increasing the size of the cortex, this pink area, because we became part of larger social groups. And it's incredibly important for human beings, and most animals, as a matter of fact, to be accepted by their groups. So there's research showing, for example, that when kids feel rejected, even in simulated games, like, throwing a ball so that someone can catch it, and you are constantly ignored, in a video game, you're not even physically there. You're just not getting the ball. Nobody's throwing the ball at you, right? You feel rejected, and those areas in the brain get activated, and it's violent. It's painful because you want to be part of a group. As a matter of fact, a lot of cults, they're born because people feel part of the group. Why do you think the flat earth movement has grown so big? It's just because people want to be part of something. They want to collaborate. They want to belong, right? So when you remove people from those groups, people who were feeling quite lonely for a very long time, it's painful. And they will probably do anything to guarantee their survival, which, from a brain perspective is you have to stick with your group. It's important. They are the ones protecting you. They are your friends, right? Now, if you look at the childhood of Chris Rock, Will Smith, and Jada Pinkett Smith, all of them grew up in abusive homes. As a matter of fact, Will Smith reported that he saw his father punch his mother in the head, and she was bleeding, and he felt powerless, like he couldn't do anything to help her. Can you imagine growing up with that feeling of powerlessness and being unable to protect your loved ones? So maybe when Chris Rock said what he did, and he realized that she was feeling incredibly hurt, he attacked him because he was acting on instinct, trying to protect his loved ones from a feeling that had been brewing inside his head for a very long time. Jada Pinkett Smith, she was also abused, and there's a different layer there because she is part of a vulnerable group. she's a black woman. So she's black and she's a woman. So that adds to the layer of discrimination and abuse that she suffered as a kid, as a teenager, as a grown woman. She has achieved lots of success, yes. But we can all agree that it's hard. It's been much harder for her. And one of the things that she mentions, and again, you can do your research, is that her parents were also abusive. They were in a very violent relationship, and that became sort of a role model. And her father was always drunk, and that led her to her drug abuse for 20 years. So you see, there's a lot of violence also there. And then Chris Rock. So many of you may have heard or even watched his biographical series, right? Everybody Hates Chris. So he was the only black kid in his school. I mean, one of the only black kids. He was bullied by many people for most of his life. He was also expected to achieve great things. You know, his parents always expected more of him. So can you imagine the pressure? He was also diagnosed with a nonverbal learning disability, and he admitted a couple of times, it was even on one of his comedy shows, that he was addicted to pornography, and that ruined his marriage. So all of those people grew up in abusive homes. And when you do that, it's very hard for you to develop self-regulation, because self-regulation is directly connected to the idea of executive functions. So executive functions are very important skills that help you plan, organize, and act when you are learning anything or doing anything for that matter. So we have updating, working memory. So that's the ability to hold information in your brain until you consolidate that and manipulate information as you need it. And then you have switching or cognitive flexibility, and that's really trying different approaches to different problems when you see that what you're doing is not working. And finally, and this one is really related to self-regulation, you have inhibiting or inhibitory control. And that is the ability to stop impulses and behaviors that are not wanted because of the situation you're in. So we know there's research on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And kids who come from abusive homes, they cannot self-regulate very well. Everything gets messed up in their heads. And guess what? They replicate the violence that they suffered as kids. You know, one of the most brilliant Brazilian educators, Paulo Freire, said that the dream of those who are oppressed is to become the oppressor. In a way, that makes total sense, right? Because we replicate those terrible, terrible things that happen to us if we are in an abusive home. And as you're growing up, you look up to people and you follow their role model. And unfortunately, what happened there is exactly what's going to happen, or not necessarily that. It could be something else. I mean, they ended up being successful anyway, right? They're excellent actors and actresses, right? They have achieved lots and lots of success. But they're human, and they're also animals. We all are. And what they did was terrible. It was wrong. It just set a horrible example to the whole world, you know? Chris Rock, who had been bullied his entire life, became the bully. And he did something terrible that offended Jada, who had been in an abusive relationship with her parents, who were violent to one another. And then Will Smith felt that he needed to protect somebody he loved because he was unable to protect his mom against his dad, for example. And you see those violent cycles, they repeat and they go on. So that means that if we want our students and our kids to grow up to be, you know, functional and healthy human beings, and of course, those things might still happen. It all depends on how intense the emotional states are, right? I mean, we've lost our temper, haven't we? Now and again. This happens. We're only humans. We're only primates. We're only animals, actually. So it might still happen. But chances are it's not going to happen very often, maybe never, if we develop our executive functions, if we are in a healthy relationship with our parents and friends, if we are not abused psychologically, verbally, or physically. Then we can trust people, and we do have a sense of belonging. That's so important for our brains. That's how the brains evolved. So remember, self-regulation is your ability to stop your impulses, to act in a different way, to change the outcomes of anything that happens to you. And I'm not saying we shouldn't react violently sometimes. Sometimes we cannot stop that, really. And sometimes we are being hurt and oppressed, and we got to do something. And maybe that's the only option you have. But we can do better. We can do better. If somebody doesn't initiate the violence against you, like Chris Rock did against Jada, you don't have to respond as violently as Will Smith did. And then we can try to break the cycle, because violence creates more violence. So my tip for you is, if you're a teacher, remember to connect with your students, to have rapport, to help them realize that they belong there, that they're part of the group, that they're not being neglected. Try not to be abusive. It's hard, I know. Sometimes we say something we don't want to say, but try to make sure that you have their backs, no matter if they make a mistake or if they're offensive. I know that life can be very cruel sometimes, and you might feel like you're not preparing them to deal with the cruelty of the world. But trust me, if you do the things I'm telling you, you can help them develop their executive functions and self-regulation skills so that they will better manage their impulses and behavior and be healthier, more functional human beings. So as a teacher, I feel like we can do that. We can always listen to our students and embrace their problems, give advice, and make sure that they know we have their backs. And if they are going through something that is too complicated in their household, with their families, there's always, calling someone to help. Maybe you have an educational psychologist at the school, somebody who can actually intervene, because you might be able to break the violent cycle if you just do something about it. That's it, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember, self-regulation is very important. We can help develop it. We are always going to be there as co-regulators, but we can certainly promote self-regulation. If you like this video, please subscribe, leave a comment. I would love to know your opinion on this so that we can interact more often, and go back to the other videos, watch them. Again, comment, and you know where to find me. So I will see you when I see you.